people I'd known since I was a youth. Here my friend's baby and my baby lived in the very same room. It was a spiritual problem. How could we personally stand up to what was happening and still endure? I said to myself, keep calm, stay under control. You have to take action against the invader.
The Egyptians believed that conquering Yad Mordechai constituted a great victory. Their army prepared a propaganda film to boast of the achievement. It was mostly simulated. At the kibbutz itself, the Egyptians staged a replay of the action. The only really true scenes of the battle at Yad Mordechai were these, filmed in the kibbutz cowshed. The Egyptian filmmakers showed how many cows their forces had killed. The Egyptian flag flew over kibbutz Yad Mordechai. In Jerusalem there were continual skirmishes. Ben-Gurion was determined to hold the city, but Jerusalem was still cut off from the coast, and food was scarce. When a convoy did get through with precious food and ammunition, it was a joyous event. It was not certain that the Israelis could defend the new city, much less the Jewish quarter of the old city. On the 27th of May, the old city fell. It was a heartbreaking end to a story of courage and of desperate hope. The Arab Legion freed the women and children, who were allowed to proceed to West Jerusalem. They held the men as prisoners of war. One of the Jewish fighters was Esther Kalingold, a religious girl originally from Britain. She was hit by a Jordanian shell on the last day of battle. When the Jewish quarter surrendered, Jordanian soldiers brought her, wounded but still alive, to the nearby Armenian monastery. Though on her deathbed, she refused the offer of a cigarette. It was the Sabbath, and smoking was forbidden. She had written to her parents just a few days earlier, "I am writing to beg you that whatever may have happened to me, you will make the effort to take it in the spirit that I want. For I myself have no regrets. We have had a bitter fight. I have tasted hell. But it has been worthwhile, because I am quite convinced that the end will see a Jewish state and the realization of all our longings. I am full of pleasure at the thought that you will come and enjoy the fruits of that for which we are fighting. Be happy and remember me only in happiness. Shalom and goodbye. Your loving Esther." Conscious of a special history, they fought for political independence, but also they felt for the very life and future of the Jewish people. The first months of war saw them stand their ground against an enemy determined to destroy them.
The feeling was that this is a terminal war. We fight not for a certain victory, not a victory in a certain battle, but the battle is for our physical survival of each one of us as a nation, of us as a group, and of our country, and of all our history.
It was the end of May 1948. Jewish independence was already a fact. In the words of the English girl, Esther Kalingold, "Whether others interfere or help us in our difficulties, we know we shall get over them." The confidence was great, but fighting was taking place all over the country. During several weeks of harsh fighting, the new Israel had defended itself against 5 invading Arab armies and had gained stunning victories. Much of the Galilee was in Israeli hands, from Tiberias in the east to Haifa in the west. In the south of the country, the Egyptian advance had been halted well short of Tel Aviv, although Egyptian forces straddled the northern Negev and had the potential for offensive action. In the center, the Arab Legion held most of what is known as the West Bank. King Abdullah hoped to annex that area to Transjordan. The western part of the city of Jerusalem remained Jewish but was under siege. The Jewish quarter of the old city and Judaism's most holy place, the Western Wall, were in Arab hands. The last big obstacle to holding the western part of Jerusalem was this police fort at Latrun. It controlled the entrance to the gorge up to the city. Unless the road to Jerusalem were opened up once and for all, Jewish Jerusalem would be vulnerable. Ben-Gurion decided to apply all available resources and pay whatever the price to capture Latrun. Menachem Ullman was a platoon commander in the battle.
We loved Ben-Gurion, but sometimes he took on himself things that he was not very professional. And he gave the order to take the people from the ship, the one who went from the concentration camp after the Holocaust, and to attack Latrun from the side of Tel Aviv. The people have not seen Tel Aviv, and a lot of them, they died here, right straight here.
It had been a searingly hot day. The attacking force lacked ammunition, and many did not even have water bottles. More than 100 Jews died in that first attack on Latrun, one of the heaviest losses ever incurred by Israel in a single battle. Many of those who died were Holocaust survivors, with no remaining family to mourn them. As the siege of Jerusalem intensified, a second attack on Latrun seemed imperative. It was launched on the 30th of May. The orders were to drive the Arab Legion from the police fort. 8 Israeli armored cars took part in the attack. They reached the walls of the fort, but were driven off under intense hails of fire. Among the fighters was a Holocaust survivor from Lithuania, Solly Ganor.
The problem was to actually open the huge gate. It was a very heavy gate. And once we sort of broached it, the infantry was supposed to move in. And when we really came up quite close, and we were a few meters away, and there was nobody behind us, they started shooting at us from all directions, from the windows of the fortress.
The Arab Legion held the fort, and the Israelis were forced to withdraw. The road to Jerusalem remained blocked. With the Israeli army approaching exhaustion, a different route to Jerusalem had to be found. That route was found almost by chance. The failure to take Latrun meant that there was no road link to Jerusalem. 2 Israeli soldiers were given permission to go home on leave to the coast, provided they did so at their own risk. It was they who discovered this track. On June the 1st, it was used by a platoon of Israeli soldiers, followed by a single jeep. The track ran in the no-man's land between the 2 armies, parallel to the road. As porters and mules rushed supplies along it to Jerusalem, construction began on a road that could take trucks. The building of the Burma Road, named after a Second World War supply route from India to China, ended the siege of Jerusalem. Nothing could now stop the supplies coming into Jerusalem. Still, with the ceasefire approaching, the Jordanian Arab Legion retained the Latrun fort. Ben-Gurion ordered Israeli commanders to launch a final attack. The Palmach Jerusalem unit was joined by additional forces brought down specially from the north. Among the fighters was Yair Parag.
There was no time to cooperate enough and to organize logistically between the 2 different groups. The one come from Jerusalem, one come all the way from Galilee. The result was a mistake that the local people occupied the wrong hill, although they were familiar with the area, but they made a mistake.
The attack failed. During the retreat, his commander told the lightly armed Yair Parag and 2 other soldiers to block the road against a possible Arab counterattack.
So we asked him, and when to retreat, and he said, to what direction to retreat, he said. And which we understood that he planned that we stay here for good. And I can tell you that it was the only time during the whole war, and I was in war for the whole year, almost every night, the only one time that I had the real feeling that today I am going to die.
That Arab counterattack never came. In the north of the country, under the shadow of Mount Hermon, the Israelis consolidated their gains. But in the last days before the ceasefire, both Kaukji and the Syrian army tried desperately for a single dramatic victory. The Syrians focused their attack here, at Mishmar HaYarden. The commander of a Haganah reserve unit here was Tzvi Raskin.
I got an order from the brigade commander. He said that en route to us there were 2 guns, 2 65mm guns, from the area of Degania to the south of us. We got them finally, and we began to shoot at the Syrians. We shot about 10 rounds, not more than that, and then the Syrian attack broke, and they dispersed.
A second Syrian attack was foiled by a minefield. On the night of the 9th of June, with the ceasefire approaching, the Syrians attacked for a 3rd time, this time in an area unprotected by mines. They succeeded in establishing a foothold and then in overrunning the settlement. A ceasefire was agreed on the 10th of June. Both sides were exhausted. Here at Latrun, the ceasefire was supervised by United Nations officers. The bodies of the dead had lain in the sweltering heat for days and were beginning to decompose. Now, after the fierce battles, there was an exchange of the dead. In almost 4 weeks of continual combat against regular armies, Israel had lost 1,100 soldiers and civilians, a serious loss for a young country. But there was also a sense of exhilaration. It no longer seemed likely or even possible that the Arabs could destroy the state of Israel or wipe it from the map of the Middle East.
In the last few days before the ceasefire, I wanted very much to be wounded. To survive and to reach the ceasefire, then I shall be alive after the war. But when the ceasefire came, we were very much disappointed because we had a feeling that we did not finish our business.
That first ceasefire came to us as dew from heaven, one Israeli commander proclaimed. Soldiers went home to see their families, their friends, their loved ones, for the first time in months. The first truce gave Israel a much-needed breathing space. Using its procurement agents overseas, Israel brought in arms and ammunition, thereby securing a slender but real advantage over its Arab enemies. The Israeli army, once a paltry force, had now grown to 49,000 men and women. Training intensified. A determined effort was made to get the planes that could form a real air force to counter Arab attacks. Some of the planes came from the United States, others from Europe, particularly from Czechoslovakia. Many of the young pilots were World War II veterans from the Allied armies, from America and Britain. The planes were the nucleus of the Israel Air Force. They were swiftly integrated into the order of battle to provide critical support to Israeli ground units. Among the ships carrying arms to Israel was the Altalena. Its hold contained enough arms to supply several battalions. The Altalena had been procured and supplied by the dissident Irgun movement. It was feared by Ben Gurion as a separate private army. Irgun leader Menachem Begin and Ben Gurion, after bitter negotiations, failed to reach agreement on where the arms should go or who should get them. Meanwhile, the Altalena approached closer to Israel's shore. It was summer. There was a ceasefire, and the Tel Aviv beaches seemingly provided welcome relief from the trauma of war. The Altalena arrived from Europe, off the seashore here at Tel Aviv. On board were many Irgun supporters and arms destined for the Irgun forces. Ben-Gurion was determined that there should be no independent private armies in the new state and insisted that the Irgun give up both the ship and its arms. When the Irgun refused, he gave the orders to open fire. The Altalena incident threatened the young state with civil war. One of the army's best young commanders, Yitzhak Rabin, carried out the Prime Minister's command. Jews killed Jews and valuable arms were lost overboard in the Mediterranean Sea. At the end of the day, Ben-Gurion won, uniting the army into a single undisputed command, though he had risked splitting the nation. Irgun leaders, including Begin, went to the funerals of their colleagues. The truce lasted until the 9th of July. What followed was a 10-day cyclone of Israeli activity that advanced Israel's positions in many places throughout the country. 4 areas were central to the new round of fighting. In the north, at Shfaram and Nazareth, the Israelis gained control of the remaining Arab villages and cities that could still form pockets of resistance. At the center of the country, just below the Galilee, intelligence and tactical failures cost the Israelis a clear victory. Iraqi army forces continued to hold this bulge near the Arab city of Jenin. And then there were 2 other places, Lod and Ramleh. Lod and Ramleh were Arab cities that had the potential to block free movement of Israeli forces to the Negev and to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, and threatened the safety of Jewish areas along the Mediterranean. Under the overall command of Yigal Allon and the tactical leadership of Moshe Dayan, the Israelis moved to capture this area of large Arab population. The Arab towns of Lod and Ramleh were being used by the Arab armies as a base from which to attack the coastal plain. An Israeli operation was launched against them on July the 9th. On the following day, the Israeli Commando Battalion, led by Moshe Dayan, broke into Lod. The raid here only lasted for 47 minutes, but caused confusion among the Arab forces. 2 days later, Ramleh was occupied. Thousands of Arabs fled, encouraged to do so by the Israeli officers at Ben-Gurion's express command. The center of the country was now Israel's. Israel captured the country's sole international airport, built by the British, near Lod, and immediately began converting it into an operational airbase. Scarcely 20 miles to the south, the Egyptians had set up their headquarters in the Arab town of Mijdal, part of Ashkelon today. This Egyptian film, captured several months later by Israel, shows Mijdal under Egyptian control. The Egyptians were convinced that their forces could not only hold the northern Negev, but expand those areas under Egyptian rule. Among the positions held by the Egyptians were the former British police stations at Iraq El Manshia and here at Iraq Sweidan. The Iraq Sweidan fort anchored Egyptian positions in the northern Negev, areas controlled by Egypt that came to be known as the Fallujah pocket. On the 12th of July, Egyptian forces from Iraq Sweidan attacked Kibbutz Negba, only 2 miles away. A fierce fight ensued. A few hundred kibbutzniks staved off the attack of the regular Egyptian army, breaking their offensive. By the end of 10 days' fighting, the map had been transformed again. There was a new ceasefire. Though the Israelis seemed more secure, most of the Negev still lay in Egyptian hands. The United Nations now pressed for a political solution that would stabilize the situation. Their chosen emissary was a distinguished Swede, Count Folke Bernadotte, a man who had helped Jewish refugees during World War II. Bernadotte traveled to the critical areas of dispute and formulated a compromise that most Jews interpreted as being pro-Arab. His plan, welcomed by the Egyptians and the British, would have left the entire Negev desert to the Arabs, not to the Israelis as formulated in the United Nations' original partition plan. On September the 17th, Count Bernadotte was driving to tea with the Israeli military governor of Jerusalem when his car was ambushed on this corner by the Stern Gang, and he was murdered. His murder was immediately denounced by the government of Israel. Ben-Gurion ordered, arrest all Stern Gang leaders, surround all Stern bases, confiscate all arms, kill any who resist. The murderers of Bernadotte were never found. Only recently, biographies and recollections have indicated who in the right-wing group actually pulled the trigger. The war resumed on the 15th of October. The Israelis were desperate to free the Negev. They formulated a plan of attack against the Egyptian forces. The Egyptians were particularly adept at fighting from fixed positions. The fort at Iraq-Sudan saw 7 battles between Israeli and Egyptian forces. Many Israeli lives were lost in head-on attacks. Finally, the Israelis bypassed many Egyptian positions, and on the 21st of October opened an attack on the capital of the Negev, the biblical city of Beersheba.
To take Beersheba was relatively easy, and I do not know why. I think that maybe because the Egyptians lost the spirit to fight. They did not imagine that we will dare to capture the capital of the Negev.
After an exchange of fire, Egyptians inside the Beersheba police fort surrendered. The nearby mosque was also captured. At 9:15 in the morning of the 22nd of October, Israeli Brigade headquarters received the message, Beersheba is in our hands. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, a new general ceasefire was ordered. The Israelis had taken considerable territory. Kibbutz Yad Mordechai was liberated. The Israeli kibbutzniks, the residents of Yad Mordechai, returned to their homes. It was a somber homecoming. For 5 months the kibbutz had been under Egyptian military control. Much of it was destroyed. The Israelis' first job was properly to rebury the kibbutz members who had fallen. They had then to proceed with the reconstruction of their homes. Meanwhile, in the north of the country, the Israelis launched Operation Hiram, named after the king of Tyre in the Lebanon, who had sent cedars to aid King Solomon in constructing the first temple in Jerusalem in biblical times. The aim of Operation Hiram was to capture all of the Galilee up to the mandatory boundaries of the country. The operation was meant to destroy the remaining forces of Kaukji and his Palestine Liberation Army, and then expel Syrian, Lebanese, and Iraqi forces from the country. The operation was brilliantly successful. Kaukji's army was totally defeated. Some 1,500 rifles were captured, and in addition, many machine guns, anti-tank rifles, and food. The Arabs of Galilee now chose to stay in their villages. They surrendered. They did not flee, and many welcomed the Israelis. Throughout the areas controlled by the Israeli army, it sought peaceful relationships with the Arab villagers. Army units collected arms and ammunition from Arab villagers. It was the beginning of a new era. Arabs who remained made their peace with the Jews and became citizens of the new state. But in the immediate aftermath of the war, Arab villages were placed under Israeli military control. The Israeli forces entered Druze villages as well. The Druze had their own religion, an offshoot of Islam. Many Druze had already chosen to ally themselves with the Jews, not the Arabs, and had actually served in the Israeli army during the fighting. Now all Druze villages joined in the close alliance between the Jews and Druze. The entire Druze population became citizens of the State of Israel. During November, the Israelis continued to make advances throughout the Negev. The Givati Brigade formed a cavalry unit that roamed the Negev, seizing terrain that motorized units found impenetrable. An effective ceasefire had been achieved on the Jordanian front. Israel saw the continued Egyptian determination to fight as an opportunity. The Egyptian authorities tried to conceal their weak position from their own public, afraid of criticism at home and even of internal unrest. On the 10th of December 1948, Yigal Yadin, Director of Operations of the Israeli forces, gave the order, defeat of the invading enemy and its expulsion to the boundaries of the country. In preparation for the battle, his operations officer, Yitzhak Rabin, secretly laid repairs to an ancient Roman road which led straight across the Negev into the Sinai. Battle began on the night of December 22nd, 23rd. Commanded by Yigal Allon, the Israeli forces freed the whole of the western Negev. The aim of the operation was not only to capture territory, but to compel the Egyptians to open negotiations for an armistice. The Israelis thrust forward in well-coordinated actions. Though there were some Israeli setbacks, the advance westward was rapid. Many Egyptian soldiers were taken prisoner. The Egyptian army was still a fighting force, but the large number of prisoners cast doubt on its future effectiveness.
We participated very actively and efficiently in an operation called the Horev campaign. Horev is one of the names of Mount Sinai. So the target, the objective of that operation campaign was to drive away the Egyptian army from the recognized frontiers of Palestine, namely Oj al-Hafir, today Nitzana.
It was here at Nitzana, on the 27th of December 1948, that the crucial battle took place for control of the western Negev. The Egyptian forces were astride the old Turkish railway line, strongly dug in and fortified. After a fierce battle, they were defeated, and many high-ranking Egyptian officers were taken prisoner. Hitherto, the Egyptian army had been fighting on Israeli soil. Now it had to look to the defense of Egypt itself. The Sinai sun had set on many wars. The end of this one was now at hand. With the route westward into the Sinai desert open, Israel wanted to secure the best possible terms for peace. Almost immediately, Yigal Allon ordered the Israeli troops to cross into Sinai. They advanced speedily, threatening to cut off the Egyptian army in Gaza. Egypt was suddenly ready for talks with Israel, though not while Israeli troops remained on Egyptian soil. The British, in support of Egypt, sent 5 planes to scout Israeli positions in Sinai. Israel managed to shoot them down, an incredible military achievement for Israel's young air force, and a humiliation for Britain. The downing only increased the political pressure on Israel. Ben-Gurion, under mounting British and American pressure, ordered his troops to withdraw. Israeli soldiers were already at El Arish in northern Sinai when they received the order. Yigal Allon and his deputy, Yitzhak Rabin, were unhappy. They thought that Israel could negotiate a full peace with Egypt before leaving Sinai. Israel withdrew. Within days, armistice talks began on the island of Rhodes in the Mediterranean. The Rhodes talks were chaired by the American-born United Nations intermediary, Ralph Bunche. The initial atmosphere was frosty. Though the Egyptians finally agreed to sit together in the same room, they refused to speak directly to the Israelis. The head of the Israeli delegation was Walter Eitan.
The Egyptians addressed their remarks exclusively to Bunche, as if we were not there. For us, we of course saw the Egyptians were there, and we were interested in including the Egyptians, but this distance was still artificially maintained for a little while, until one member of our delegation, and I can't remember now who it was, but one member of our delegation said something which offended the Egyptians, I think offended them terribly. So they immediately turned on him and said, "You have no right to say anything of the kind." And then all of a sudden they realized that they'd spoken directly to the Israeli delegation. After all, they were only human, and when they heard something which annoyed them, they reacted directly. In that way, the ice was broken.
As a result of the armistice, signed on the 24th of February, Egyptian troops withdrew from the Fallujah pocket, fully vacating Israeli territory. The Egyptian general Said Taha, nicknamed the Sudanese Tiger, had fought well and was respected by the Israelis. Israel gained the entire northern Negev without further fighting. As part of the armistice agreement, Egypt retained control of the crowded Gaza Strip, where many Palestinian refugees had also gathered. With the Egyptian talks looking successful, there was a hope for peace on all fronts, and the beginning of normal life here in Jerusalem. The Israelis were eager to establish their state and their democracy. No symbol of viable democratic government was more potent than that of a parliament. Ben-Gurion decided on opening the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, at the Jewish Agency building in Jerusalem on the 14th of February 1949. The building was the same one that had been partially blown up by an Arab terrorist the year before. The Egyptian negotiations had left the disposition of the Negev open. Talks with the Lebanese and Transjordanian governments began on the 1st of March. The Jordanians had thought of claiming the Negev for themselves. The Israelis wanted it for Israel, as proposed in the United Nations partition plan. The last Israeli operation of the war was launched on the 5th of March 1949. Advancing southward through the Negev desert, 2 Israeli units competed to be the first to reach the head of the Gulf of Aqaba and the former British police post at Eilat, a distance of 150 miles. These actual films of the operation were taken by Israeli army photographers. The Israeli forces followed 2 separate routes through the Negev. Both brigades were under orders to avoid combat with enemy forces. Scouts from the air and on the ground established the location of Arab outposts. The Israelis advanced steadily through the dramatic desert landscape. The Negev Brigade reached the police station at Eilat at 3 o'clock in the afternoon of March the 10th. There had been no resistance. They also had no Israeli flag with them. They improvised in what Israeli law became known as the ink flag, a flag drawn only in ink. A message went back to headquarters: the Palmach Negev Brigade and the Golani Brigade present the Gulf of Eilat to the State of Israel. Meanwhile, the Jordanian negotiations continued. Borders were marked out in the Jerusalem area. Some thought the talks would fail. King Abdullah kept a delegation talking in Rhodes, but decided to conduct the substantive negotiations himself in Transjordan.
We received a message from the King of Jordan, King Abdullah, the grandfather of the present king, that he wanted to negotiate the basic terms of the armistice in person. In other words, he did not rely on his delegation in Rhodes to negotiate the details of the agreement, and we decided everything directly with him, and the decisions were then communicated to the delegations in Rhodes.
Talks resulted in significant border corrections. Israel got Wadi Ara in the north, including a series of Arab villages where Iraqi troops had occupied the hills. Wadi Ara provided Israel more direct access between the coastal plain and the eastern Galilee. Ben-Gurion had wanted it desperately. In exchange, the Israelis gave up a small strip of land near Hebron. Another Israeli aim was to control the railroad that ran from the coast up to Jerusalem. Near Jerusalem, it went through the Arab village of Bet Safafa. King Abdullah agreed to give Israel the railroad and divide the village, expecting Israeli acquiescence in his own plans to annex the entire west bank of the Jordan. After the war, the situation of the Arabs was nowhere more bizarre than in this village of Beit Safafa, just south of Jerusalem. Under the armistice agreement, this railway and that part of the village to my right went to Israel, the village part to my left to Jordan. European railway carriages have a sign, "Do not lean out of the window." Israelis used to joke that carriages on this line had a sign, "Do not lean out of the state." Meanwhile, the doors of the state had been opened. The new state declared the right of return. Any Jew wishing to do so could come to the country and make it his. Jews poured into Israel. From the very first days of the new state, immigrants arrived here in Haifa port in their hundreds, their thousands, and their tens of thousands. They came from Europe, including survivors of the Holocaust, from North Africa, from the Americas, from Iran, Iraq, even from India. Just as the resources of the port were strained to its utmost in order to bring them in, so the state had to use incredible exertions to absorb them. With the war over, the Israelis had to think about demobilizing and then establishing a proper army to defend the state. The weaponry shipped into Israel during the war was enough to form the foundation of a peacetime army. Now there were thousands of trained, battle-tested soldiers, augmented by newcomers from around the world. The Israel Defense Forces had proved themselves in battle, but the Chief of Staff, Yigal Yadin, realized that a permanent army would be needed to defend the new state. Israel was too poor a nation to afford a large standing army. Yadin went to Switzerland, where he was impressed by the citizens' army there. Israel's citizens' army was based upon compulsory military service and an ever-growing pool of reserves. In March 1949, a British Jew, Bernard Beecham, decided to visit the State of Israel. Beecham had been a soldier in the Second World War, but had never served in Palestine. He was inspired by a vision to capture on film the feel of the life of the new state, and to do so in color. What follows is Beecham's extraordinary photographic record of life in Israel in March and April 1949. This was Lod Airport. Many years later, and many renovations later, it would become known as Ben Gurion International Airport. Tel Aviv was a small Mediterranean city. It was the aftermath of war, not too much traffic. Special concerts were offered. Many soldiers still wandered the streets. The hulk of the Altalena still hovered off the Tel Aviv coast. And this is Bernard Beecham, the jaunty photographer of Israel in its very first days, the ex-British soldier. Beecham went to Jaffa, still scarred by war. Here, the central bus station of Herzliya, north of Tel Aviv. After a few days, Beecham traveled to Jerusalem. The contrast with Tel Aviv could not have been greater. Jerusalem, high in the hills, is colder than Tel Aviv. In the first months after the war, it was a somber city, a city seemingly heavy with history, an incomplete city, marked by its recent strife and resulting division, to which the eternal stones of Jerusalem had been witness. It was a city that was destined to remain the capital of Israel. But in March 1949, it was a city permeated by the aftermath of battle. Beecham's cameras reached over the walls of division to document from afar the Transjordanian side of the city, which held many religious holy sites, including the Western Wall, Judaism's holiest site, with which the Jordanians refused to allow Israelis to visit. Beecham then went south. At the fortress called Iraq Swedan, he saw the remains of war. He visited the nearby kibbutz called Negba, that had so valiantly resisted Egyptian advances. Overseas volunteers working in the kibbutz kitchen posed for Beecham's camera. From kibbutz Negba, Beecham traveled further south to Beersheba, capital of the Negev desert. The reminders of war were everywhere. Bedouin soldiers now served in the Israeli army. The city gave little hint of the metropolis it was destined to become, though the Israeli flag flew over it. The Bedouins who wandered the Negev desert still came to Beersheba to drink coffee in the town's cafes and to sell their goods. They would become Israeli citizens. From the Negev desert, Beecham traveled north. One of his stops was at a Jordan Valley kibbutz called Ashdod Yaakov. The kibbutz was a thriving enterprise. Its members could once again be farmers, not soldiers. Beecham approached the city of Tiberias from the southern end of the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee. Tiberias commands a view of the Sea of Galilee and its sights. The city was still partially in ruins. There were warning signs, danger, mines. There were reminders of war everywhere. But the city seemed to be starting life again. The sense of renewed life was everywhere. The city and its nearby sites are precious to Christians. This is where Jesus spent his last years. Beecham climbed aboard a small boat to travel across the lake to the kibbutz Ein Gev, which stood directly under the Syrian guns on these hills. Armistice negotiations with the Syrians had not yet begun, but the guns were quiet. And here too, life was beginning again. Back in Tiberias, Israeli soldiers were out for some well-deserved R&R, rest and recreation. It was April 1949, and the incredible thing about the young people of Israel was their spontaneity. These were among the very first weeks and months of a new life for the people of Israel. Then, as if from nowhere, above the Sea of Galilee, there emerged a rainbow. Israel's War of Independence was a war for the establishment of a state, and also for the survival of a people. The fortunes of war determined the ceasefire lines. Armistice negotiations established borders that lasted for 19 years, until Israel was threatened once again. Those who fought in Israel's War of Independence remember it as the most dramatic and important period of their lives, a contribution to their people and its future. The State of Israel was now established. 6,000 Jews had been killed in the War of Independence, 1% of the population. The State of Israel offered a ray of hope that at the end of great suffering there could be rebirth and a new life. A people had returned to the land from which they had sprung.
Mm-hmm.